Massive crash between Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc during the Bahrain tests. Stay until the end to find out the possible penalties the FIA is considering. Subscribe only if you want Hamilton to win his 8th World Championship and be crowned as the greatest driver in history. The world of Formula One has been thrown into absolute chaos following one of the most unexpected, dramatic, and utterly shocking incidents in recent pre-season testing history. What was supposed to be a routine day of data collection, fine-tuning setups, and evaluating long-run pace has instead turned into a moment that will be dissected, debated, and remembered for years to come. The unthinkable has happened. Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton, two of the most accomplished, respected, and fiercely competitive drivers on the modern F1 grid, have collided on track during testing. And not just a minor misjudgment, a simple wheel-to-wheel brush, or an insignificant coming together. No, this was a catastrophic high-speed full-force crash that has sent shockwaves through the paddock, left engineers and strategists scrambling for answers, and ignited a firestorm of controversy between Ferrari and Mercedes. Subscribe only if you want Hamilton to win his 8th World Championship and be crowned as the greatest driver in history. The accident, which unfolded in the scorching midday heat of Bahrain's Sakir International Circuit, has led to immediate red flags, extensive damage to both cars, and an atmosphere of palpable tension within both camps. The fallout is already immense. Engineers are frantically assessing the extent of the damage, strategists are recalculating lost mileage, and team principals are engaging in a war of words behind closed doors, each desperate to control the narrative. Accusations are being whispered through the paddock, theories are being spun, and the FIA has already confirmed that an investigation is underway. But while everyone scrambles to make sense of the wreckage, both literal and figurative, the question on everyone's lips is the same: how did this happen? The build-up to disaster, a perfect storm of circumstances. To understand the magnitude of this crash, one must first examine the context in which it occurred. Tensions between Ferrari and Mercedes had already been brewing long before either driver strapped into their cockpits this morning. Testing had been fraught with psychological battles, strategic misdirection, and carefully calculated media statements that hinted at a brewing rivalry between the two powerhouse teams. Mercedes, desperate to re-establish themselves as title contenders after back-to-back seasons in Red Bull's shadow, had arrived in Bahrain with a visibly more aggressive approach. The W15 was rumored to be a significant step forward, boasting aerodynamic refinements aimed at recapturing the stability and performance that the previous iterations lacked. Hamilton himself had been in visibly intense form throughout the testing sessions, focused, determined, and unwilling to waste a single lap. Subscribe only if you want Hamilton to win his 8th World Championship and be crowned as the greatest driver in history. Subscribe only if you want Hamilton to win his 8th World Championship and be crowned as the greatest driver in history. Meanwhile, Ferrari had come into the test equally resolute. With the SF24 promising improvements in balance and tire wear, two of the team's Achilles' heels in recent seasons, Leclerc had been on a mission to showcase Ferrari's newfound competitiveness. Both drivers had spent the morning aggressively pushing their respective machines to the limit. The tension was obvious. Engineers from both teams had been closely monitoring each other's progress, analyzing telemetry data, and making subtle adjustments in response to their rivals' performance. While neither Hamilton nor Leclerc had explicitly acknowledged any animosity, it was evident from the way they attacked each lap that neither was willing to concede any psychological ground, even in a session that held no championship points at stake. Yet, despite the simmering rivalry, no one could have predicted what was about to unfold. The incident, a catastrophic split-second collision. It all happened in the blink of an eye. The data suggests that both Hamilton and Leclerc had been lapping at a near-identical pace in the moments leading up to the crash. Leclerc, who was in the midst of a long-run simulation, had been running consistent lap times, focusing on extracting maximum efficiency from his setup. Hamilton, meanwhile, had just exited the pit lane on fresh soft tires, preparing to complete a push lap designed to evaluate the W15's low fuel performance. As Leclerc approached turn 10, a notoriously tricky left-hander that leads into the high-speed section of turn 11, Hamilton was already closing in fast. The Ferrari driver, fully committed to his racing line, was unaware that Hamilton's Mercedes was rapidly approaching with significantly higher grip and momentum. Turn 11 is one of the most deceptive corners on the Sakir circuit. The blind nature of the turn, combined with the elevation change, makes it one of the most challenging corners to judge when a faster car is closing in. From the data and radio messages, it appears that Hamilton may have expected Leclerc to lift slightly and allow him through, given that the Ferrari was in the middle of a race simulation rather than a qualifying push. However, Leclerc, committed to his programmed test run, maintained his trajectory, expecting Hamilton to slot in behind and wait until the next straight to make a clean pass. But the miscommunication between the two was fatal. Subscribe only if you want Hamilton to win his 8th World Championship and be crowned as the greatest driver in history. With both cars now hurtling toward turn 11 at immense speed, the collision became inevitable. Hamilton, carrying more momentum due to his fresh soft tires, attempted to place his Mercedes just on the inside line, perhaps believing that Leclerc would leave enough space. But in that split second, Leclerc, unaware of the precise closing speed, took his usual apex line. The inevitable happened. The front right wheel of Hamilton's W15 made direct contact with the left rear of Leclerc's SF24, sending the Ferrari into an immediate, uncontrollable spin. The sheer force of the impact snapped the rear suspension on Leclerc's car instantly, causing it to whip around violently before slamming into the barriers at over 200 km/h. Hamilton, unable to correct the sudden loss of grip, veered off track, his Mercedes digging into the gravel before coming to a jarring halt just meters away. The aftermath: chaos, confusion, and finger-pointing. The reaction was instantaneous. The session was red-flagged within seconds, with debris littering the circuit. A stunned silence fell over the paddock as team radio transmissions crackled with urgency. Ferrari's garage erupted into a mix of anger and disbelief. Engineers, mechanics, and strategists rushed to analyze the damage reports as team principal Frederick Vasseur stormed toward the FIA officials demanding answers. Mercedes, while visibly frustrated, adopted a more composed, yet equally concerned approach. When both drivers emerged from their wrecked machines, the body language was telling. Leclerc, visibly shaken but unharmed, was seen gesturing animatedly toward his car, frustration evident in every movement. Hamilton, meanwhile, took a more reserved approach, removing his helmet and walking calmly toward the pit lane, avoiding any immediate confrontation. The FIA's initial response has been to launch a full review of the telemetry data to determine if any formal blame should be assigned. But regardless of the official verdict, the damage, both physical and psychological, has already been done. The bigger picture: what this means for Ferrari, Mercedes, and the 2025 season. The implications of this crash extend far beyond the immediate wreckage. Both teams now face unexpected setbacks. Ferrari, with its already tight spare parts supply, may struggle to repair the SF24 in time for the afternoon session. Mercedes, while less severely affected, will still need to conduct a thorough examination of Hamilton's chassis and suspension. Beyond the logistics, the psychological impact of this crash could shape the season's narrative. If today is any indication, Ferrari and Mercedes are on a direct collision course, not just in testing, but in the championship fight itself. This incident has added an explosive new layer to an already fierce rivalry, setting the stage for a potentially volatile season ahead. As the paddock recovers from the shock, one thing is clear: this was not just another testing incident. This was a moment that could define the upcoming season, an accident that will be scrutinized in slow motion, frame by frame, in every analysis leading up to the first race. Formula One has seen its fair share of controversies, but this is something entirely different. The 2025 season hasn't even begun, and yet, the battle lines have already been drawn. The incident that unfolded in the final sector of the circuit was a perfect storm of miscalculation, desperation, and sheer bad luck, an explosive moment that would have lasting consequences for both teams involved. It was a sequence of events that no one saw coming, yet as soon as it happened, the paddock knew it would dominate discussions for the rest of the test. The circumstances that led to the dramatic collision between Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc were a culmination of different factors: two drivers on opposing run plans, a track layout that left little room for misjudgment, and the razor-thin margins that defined Formula One at the highest level. Hamilton was in the middle of a crucial high-fuel stint, methodically working through Mercedes' long-run program to gather data on tire degradation, fuel consumption, and race pace consistency. His laps were not about outright speed, but rather about ensuring that the W15 could sustain performance over a full Grand Prix distance under conditions as close to real racing as possible. The team had been meticulously monitoring sector times, analyzing telemetry, and evaluating how the car responded to different load conditions. Every lap completed was an opportunity to understand the machine better, to find the weak points, and to ensure that the setup was optimized for both qualifying and race trim. Leclerc, on the other hand, was on an entirely different mission. With Ferrari prioritizing single-lap performance during this phase of the test, he had been sent out on a low-fuel run, pushing the SF24 to its absolute limits in an attempt to extract the maximum potential from the car. The team had spent the morning refining aerodynamic balance, adjusting the front wing, tweaking suspension settings, and experimenting with different energy deployment strategies to improve their qualifying performance. This was a critical part of Ferrari's preparation, as the team knew that strong grid positions would be essential if they were to challenge for victories in the upcoming season. The two drivers found themselves on a collision course, figuratively and unfortunately, quite literally. As they approached turn 11, a sweeping high-commitment left-hander that required absolute precision, Leclerc, eager to clear Hamilton before entering the tight and technical final sector, made a split-second decision to send his car down the inside. Whether it was an instinctive move, a calculated risk, or a moment of overzealous aggression, the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Leclerc's entry speed was significantly higher than Hamilton's, a direct result of his lighter fuel load and the aerodynamic setup optimized for single-lap pace. However, in his urgency to get ahead, he failed to anticipate just how early Hamilton would need to brake with a heavier car. As soon as he hit the braking zone, it became clear that the move was going to be miscalculated. The front left tire of the Ferrari locked up, a telltale screech of rubber against asphalt signaling that Leclerc had exceeded the grip threshold. Once the front wheels stopped rotating, the SF24 became a passenger in its own trajectory, skidding uncontrollably toward the unsuspecting Mercedes. The impact was violent. Leclerc's car speared into the side of Hamilton's W15 with bone-rattling force, sending both machines careening off the track in a chaotic explosion of shattered carbon fiber, disintegrating bodywork, and plumes of dust. The sheer violence of the crash sent debris flying in every direction, leaving engineers, team principals, and onlookers momentarily stunned. For Mercedes, the damage assessment was grim. The right side pod of the W15 had been completely obliterated, exposing internal cooling components and delicate aerodynamic structures that were never meant to be seen outside of a wind tunnel. The intricate underfloor, which plays a critical role in the car's downforce generation, had been shredded beyond recognition. But the worst news came when the team examined the chassis. The impact had been severe enough to compromise the structural integrity of the monocoque itself, a devastating development in any context, but especially so in pre-season testing, where chassis replacements are logistically complex and time-consuming. For Ferrari, the damage was equally devastating. The SF24 had lost its entire front wing, the intricate multi-element structure crumpled into a heap of jagged carbon fiber. The front suspension had snapped under the force of the collision, leaving the car unable to steer, while additional damage to the barge boards and floor meant that even with a new front end, the aerodynamic balance would be completely compromised. Both teams immediately realized the severity of their situation. Testing time is the most valuable resource in Formula One, with each session meticulously planned to maximize data collection and car development. Losing an entire session due to an accident, especially one involving two front-running teams, was a nightmare scenario. Engineers rely on continuous, uninterrupted running to validate wind tunnel data, assess new components, and refine race strategies. With their cars now reduced to wreckage, Mercedes and Ferrari faced the daunting task of rebuilding from scratch. The Paddock reaction was immediate. Cameras zoomed in on the damaged cars, mechanics rushed to the scene, and team principals exchanged glances that conveyed a mixture of frustration and disbelief. Both Hamilton and Leclerc exited their vehicles unscathed, but the tension in their body language was undeniable. Hamilton, ever composed, walked briskly toward the paddock, offering only a brief glance at the wreckage of his car. Leclerc, meanwhile, lingered for a few moments longer, staring at his broken SF24 as if trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. Back in the garages, the real work began. Mercedes faced the monumental challenge of assembling an entirely new chassis overnight, an operation that would require every available mechanic working tirelessly through the night. The process involved not just fitting a new monocoque but also recalibrating every sensor, reinstalling the power unit, and ensuring that the entire package was race-ready by morning. For Ferrari, the rebuild was slightly less complex, but no less urgent. With limited spare parts available during testing, the team had to make difficult decisions about which components could be salvaged and which would need to be replaced entirely. As night fell over the circuit, the garages remained illuminated, a hive of activity as engineers pored over telemetry data, strategists recalculated lost mileage, and mechanics worked with surgical precision to ensure that both cars would be ready for the next session. The incident had robbed both teams of valuable data, But there was no time to dwell on what had been lost, only on what needed to be done to recover. By the following morning, against all odds, both Mercedes and Ferrari had completed their rebuilds. The W15 and SF24 emerged from their respective garages, gleaming under the floodlights, a testament to the relentless work ethic that defines Formula One. The scars of the previous day's disaster were gone, but the questions remained. Would this setback have long-term consequences? Could Mercedes and Ferrari recover from such a dramatic loss of testing mileage? And more importantly, did this moment foreshadow an even more intense rivalry between Hamilton and Leclerc as the season unfolded? One thing was certain: the 2025 Formula One season was already delivering drama before the first race had even begun. The Paddock had seen its fair share of drama over the years: tense team rivalries, controversial crashes, unexpected outbursts. But what unfolded on that scorching afternoon in Bahrain would go down as one of the most intense, visceral confrontations in recent memory. What had started as a routine pre-season testing session had spiraled into a full-blown spectacle, a moment so charged with raw emotion that even the most seasoned figures in the paddock were left speechless. The impact had been brutal. As Charles Leclerc's Ferrari lunged down the inside of Turn 1, attempting an ill-advised overtake on a slow-moving Lewis Hamilton, the inevitable happened: a sickening crunch of carbon fiber, a violent snap as Hamilton's Mercedes was sent spinning into the runoff area, its front wing detaching in an instant, the suspension crumpling under the sheer force of the collision. The Ferrari, too, had suffered significant damage. Its right front suspension snapped like a twig, its floor dragging helplessly along the tarmac as it skidded to a halt just meters away from the wreckage of the Mercedes. For a moment, there was silence, save for the distant roar of other cars circulating the track, blissfully unaware of the chaos that had just unfolded. In the Mercedes garage, stunned engineers stared at their screens, data streams abruptly cutting off, the reality of the situation sinking in. Toto Wolff, arms folded tightly across his chest, muttered something under his breath, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. At Ferrari, the reaction was more chaotic, mechanics scrambling to assess the damage remotely, while team principal Frédéric Vasseur shot a glance towards the trackside monitors, his face unreadable. Then came the real explosion. Inside the cockpit of his stricken Mercedes, Hamilton sat motionless for a beat, his hands gripping the sides of his helmet, his breathing heavy. The radio crackled to life. "Are you okay, Lewis?" Peter Bonington's voice was calm but edged with concern. Silence. Then, a sharp exhale. "Yeah, I'm fine. Cars F*** though." With a sudden, almost forceful motion, Hamilton tore off his steering wheel, unfastened his harness, and launched himself out of the cockpit. His every movement radiated frustration. There was no moment of pause, no shake of the head in disbelief. No. This was something different. This was pure, unfiltered rage. The cameras were on him instantly, every lens in the paddock capturing what was quickly turning into a high-octane drama. Hamilton barely glanced at the marshals as they rushed toward the scene. He didn't wait for a team member to escort him back to the garage. Instead, he was already moving, his gaze locked on a singular target: the Ferrari pit lane. His stride was purposeful, unrelenting. The black and silver of his Mercedes suit was streaked with dirt and tire debris, his gloves still clenched in his hands. He stormed past FIA officials, ignoring the glances from rival engineers peeking out from their garages, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding scene. The tension in the air was electric. Everyone knew what was coming, and no one wanted to miss it. Meanwhile, Charles Leclerc had just stepped out of his own wrecked Ferrari. He removed his helmet slowly, exhaling heavily as he ran a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. He had barely had a moment to process what had happened when a wave of movement in his periphery made him turn. Hamilton was coming. Leclerc's breath caught in his throat. He saw the fury in Hamilton's eyes, the unmistakable fire of a man who had been wronged. He instinctively took a step back, his hands lifting slightly as if preparing to explain, to defuse the situation before it could spiral out of control. But Hamilton wasn't here for explanations. What the hell was that? Hamilton's voice rang out across the pit lane, cutting through the hum of the garages, demanding everyone's attention. "Are you serious, Charles? You dive-bomb me like it's the last lap of a title decider in Abu Dhabi? This is testing." Leclerc, caught completely off guard, stumbled over his words. I thought you were letting me through. I had the inside line. I didn't mean." Hamilton wasn't having any of it. He took another step forward, his tone sharp, accusatory. Letting you through? On a cool-down lap? Do you even know what you just did? You've just wrecked my car. Do you have any idea how much time we just lost? How much data we needed today? You don't do this in testing, man. You just don't. The Ferrari garage was frozen. Mechanics stopped mid-task, eyes darting between their driver and the furious Brit standing before him. Vasseur, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, started to move towards them, but even he hesitated. This was a moment too raw, too intense to interfere with just yet. Leclerc shook his head, his brows knitting together as he tried again. Lewis, I swear I didn't mean to hit you. I thought you saw me coming. The gap was there. I committed. The gap was there? Hamilton let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. You don't just assume someone's going to jump out of the way in testing, Charles. This isn't race day. We're collecting data, working through programs. Not throwing the car into turn one like it's a qualifying shootout. Around them, the paddock was eerily quiet. Team members from Red Bull, Aston Martin, and Alpine peered from their garages, pretending to be occupied with their own work but keeping their ears locked onto every word. Social media was already exploding. Clips of the crash and Hamilton's furious march to the Ferrari garage were spreading like wildfire, Twitter lighting up with debates and speculation. In the Mercedes garage, Toto Wolff had abandoned his usual calm demeanor. His expression was dark, his fingers steepled as he watched the live feed. Beside him, James Allison exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. The situation was spiraling, and they knew the fallout would be immense. Leclerc's frustration started to bubble beneath his own surface now. He had taken responsibility, he had apologized, and yet Hamilton wasn't backing down. Look, I made a mistake, okay? I misjudged it. I said I was sorry, what else do you want me to say? Hamilton exhaled sharply, shaking his head. He was still fuming, but the initial fury had begun to ebb, replaced by simmering resentment. Damn right it was a mistake, he muttered. His shoulders rose and fell as he took a deep breath, trying to contain the fire still burning inside him. Sensing an opportunity to intervene, a Ferrari mechanic stepped forward, subtly placing a hand on Leclerc's shoulder as if to guide him away. Vasseur exchanged a glance with Hamilton, his expression neutral but his meaning clear. We'll deal with this later. Hamilton lingered for a moment longer, his jaw tight, before finally turning away. He had made his point. There was no fixing what had happened. His day was ruined, his car was in pieces, and whatever plans Mercedes had for that afternoon were now irrelevant. As he made his way back toward the Mercedes garage, the cameras continued to track his every move, the world hanging on to every second of what had just transpired. This wasn't just a crash. This wasn't just a heated argument. This was personal. And when the lights went out for the first race of the season, it was clear, this battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The atmosphere in the Ferrari garage was thick with tension, the kind of silence that only comes when something truly unprecedented is unfolding. The usual sounds of mechanics working methodically on the car, the occasional bursts of discussion between engineers, and the distant hum of telemetry analysis had all vanished, replaced by an eerie stillness. Every single person within earshot had stopped what they were doing, their attention laser-focused on the confrontation that had erupted between two of the biggest names in the sport. Even those who had been too far away to hear the initial exchange instinctively knew that something serious was happening. Heads turned. Conversations halted. Mechanics gripping tire guns paused mid-task. This wasn't just a minor spat over a testing incident. This had the potential to explode into something much bigger. The tension radiating from the two drivers was palpable, almost tangible, like the crackling energy in the air before a thunderstorm. On one side stood Lewis Hamilton, a driver whose reputation had been forged through years of battling at the highest level, a seven-time world champion whose name was synonymous with excellence, resilience, and an unwavering will to win. On the other stood Charles Leclerc, Ferrari's golden boy, the bright young talent hailed as the future of the Scuderia, a driver who had proven time and time again that he was more than capable of going wheel to wheel with the very best. And now, these two titans were at odds, their tempers flaring in a way rarely seen outside of the most heated race day incidents. Hamilton's eyes were ablaze with frustration, his body language tense, his every movement sharp and deliberate. He was a man who had spent his entire career perfecting the art of control. Control over his car, control over his mind, control over the high-stakes pressure that came with being one of the greatest drivers in the history of the sport. But in this moment, That control was slipping. He shook his head, exhaling sharply, as if trying to contain the storm raging inside him. "You know what?" he finally said, his voice carrying across the garage like a knife slicing through glass. "You just proved it. You're reckless." His words weren't just criticism, they were a condemnation, a declaration that what had happened on track was beyond the limits of what was acceptable. His tone was sharp, unwavering, each syllable laced with the frustration of a driver who had spent years building a legacy of precision and professionalism. He took a step closer, his gaze locked onto Leclerc's, making sure the younger driver understood the gravity of his words. "I've raced Max. I've raced Alonso. I've fought the best of the best. And none of them, not one, has ever pulled something like this. Not in testing." The weight of the accusation hung in the air, thick and heavy. To question a driver's professionalism in Formula One was no small thing. To call them reckless, in a sport where precision and trust between competitors could mean the difference between life and death, was even more serious. Leclerc's jaw clenched, his breath coming in shorter, more controlled bursts. His normally composed demeanor was cracking, his frustration bubbling to the surface. He had spent years proving himself, fighting against the perception that he was still just a rising star, that he hadn't yet earned his place among the elite. And now, here he was, being called reckless by a man whose very name was etched into the record books. "Oh, come on, Lewis." Leclerc shot back, his voice rising slightly as his emotions took hold. "You act like I did it on purpose. Maybe if you weren't sitting in the middle of the track doing nothing, we wouldn't even be having this conversation." A sharp, collective inhale rippled through the paddock. Mechanics exchanged glances. Engineers looked up from their screens. Journalists, sensing the electricity in the air, discreetly reached for their phones, ready to capture every detail. The implications of Leclerc's words were immediate and unmistakable. He had just accused Hamilton, one of the most meticulous, experienced drivers on the grid, of being the one at fault. Of being the one who had misjudged the situation. Of being the one who had, perhaps, caused the very incident he was so outraged about. Toto Wolff, who had been watching from a few meters away, moved in quickly, his strides purposeful, his expression unreadable. As Mercedes team principal, he had seen plenty of high-pressure moments. He had watched Hamilton go head-to-head with Rosberg in a rivalry so intense it nearly tore the team apart. He had navigated the explosive battles between Hamilton and Verstappen, races that had ended in controversy, crashes, and championship-deciding moments. But this was different. This wasn't a title fight. This wasn't the final lap of a Grand Prix with points on the line. This was testing, meant to be a controlled environment, a time for gathering data, understanding performance, refining setups. The fact that it had escalated to this level spoke volumes about the underlying tensions brewing beneath the surface. Frédéric Vasseur, Ferrari's team boss, had also arrived at the scene, his arms crossed, his expression tight. He had known Leclerc for years, had watched him grow from a promising young talent into one of the most formidable drivers on the grid. He understood his passion, his fire, his deep desire to win. But he also knew that this was dangerous territory. Public confrontations like this had consequences. By now, the Ferrari and Mercedes mechanics had started moving, instinctively positioning themselves between the two drivers, not quite touching them but ready to step in if necessary. The body language from both sides spoke volumes. Mercedes mechanics stood protectively near Hamilton. Ferrari's crew mirrored them around Leclerc. The air between the two drivers was electric, their eyes locked, neither willing to back down. Wolff finally placed a firm hand on Hamilton's shoulder, his voice low, authoritative. "Lewis, let's take this inside." Hamilton didn't move at first. His body remained tense, his fists still clenched at his sides. But then, with a slow exhale, he broke eye contact with Leclerc and stepped back, his expression still thunderous but his composure returning, piece by piece. Vasseur, mirroring Wolff's approach, turned to Leclerc. "Charles, let it go. We'll handle this later." Leclerc, his chest still rising and falling quickly, took a long breath. His gaze flickered between Hamilton, the Ferrari crew, and the dozens of prying eyes around them. With visible reluctance, he gave a curt nod and stepped away. The confrontation had been defused, but the impact of what had just happened would not disappear so easily. As the paddock slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, the whispers began. What had caused the incident in the first place? Was this the beginning of a full-blown rivalry between Hamilton and Leclerc? What would be the fallout? In the world of Formula One, tensions between drivers had a way of simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the perfect moment to explode. Today, the first cracks had appeared. And if history was anything to go by, this was only the beginning. The moment the dust settled on the Bahrain circuit, the ramifications of what had just unfolded became immediately apparent. In the Mercedes garage, a tense and almost eerie silence hung in the air, punctuated only by the hurried movements of mechanics already deep in the dismantling process of what was left of Hamilton's W16. The once pristine silver and black machine, meticulously engineered to be the pinnacle of speed and precision, now lay in a sorry state, its left side obliterated from the impact, floor damage extending from the barge boards all the way to the diffuser, with the rear suspension visibly compromised. Engineers hovered around the wreckage, their expressions a mixture of frustration and urgency, knowing full well that their test program had just been thrown into complete disarray. For Mercedes, the reality of the situation was brutal. Pre-season testing is not just a formality, it is the bedrock upon which an entire season is built. The team had entered the session with a carefully structured program, lap sequences designed to extract critical information about their new aerodynamic philosophy, tire degradation studies planned to optimize stint strategies, power unit stress tests aimed at ensuring reliability across an expanded 24-race calendar. All of it was now in jeopardy. Every single lap lost in testing is a lap that cannot be recovered, and with a completely new chassis needing to be installed, the clock was against them. Replacing a chassis is not a simple affair. It is an operation requiring meticulous precision, a process that can take anywhere between 8 to 12 hours depending on the extent of the damage and the specific components that need to be transferred. The car must be entirely stripped down. Gearbox, suspension components, electronic control units, hydraulic systems, cooling structures, all must be delicately removed and reinstalled onto the replacement monocoque. Every cable and sensor, every connector and mounting point, must be reattached with the utmost care to ensure nothing is misplaced or miscalibrated. One small misalignment in the assembly process, and the car could suffer from aerodynamic inconsistencies, electrical failures, or even structural weaknesses that could compromise its performance across the upcoming race weekends. As the Mercedes mechanics worked with surgical precision, trying to salvage what remained of their meticulously planned test program, the situation inside the Ferrari garage was no less chaotic. While Leclerc's SF25 had escaped complete destruction, it was far from unscathed. The right front suspension had been reduced to little more than shredded carbon fiber, the wishbones snapped like twigs upon impact. The front wing had been ripped off entirely, the nose cone crumpled from the force of the collision, and the intricate aerodynamic elements on the side pod bore deep scars from the scrape against the barriers. Despite the visible damage, Ferrari's mechanics sprang into action with military-like discipline, knowing that every second lost in repair time meant less time on track to gather invaluable data. Unlike Mercedes, they were not dealing with a full chassis replacement, but that did not make their task any easier. Suspension components needed to be completely rebuilt and recalibrated. The floor had to be checked for microfractures. Any undetected structural weakness could spell disaster when subjected to the extreme forces of high-speed cornering. The electronics team scrambled to ensure that the sensors, telemetry systems, and power unit connections remained intact and functional. As engineers pored over the telemetry data from the crash, trying to determine the precise sequence of events that led to the impact, another storm was brewing outside the garages. The FIA had already initiated an immediate review of the incident, summoning stewards to examine the available footage, GPS tracking data, and radio communications from both drivers. These incidents in pre-season testing are rare, but when they do occur, they send shockwaves throughout the paddock. While official penalties in a non-competitive session are uncommon, the stakes were too high to ignore the broader implications. Would Leclerc face disciplinary action for what some were already calling an unnecessary display of aggression? Would Mercedes lodge a formal complaint, demanding repercussions for what they viewed as reckless driving? Or would this simply be classified as a racing incident, an unfortunate but inevitable byproduct of two ultra-competitive drivers unwilling to yield an inch on the track? Tensions between Ferrari and Mercedes, already simmering beneath the surface, were now threatening to reach a boiling point. Both teams had entered the season with high expectations, Ferrari determined to capitalize on their aggressive development strategy, Mercedes desperate to reclaim their former dominance after 2 years of playing catch-up to Red Bull. Now, with both teams losing valuable track time and pointing fingers at one another, the animosity that had been quietly building for months was now out in the open for the entire world to see. Leclerc, for his part, remained locked in deep discussions with his race engineers, reviewing the sequence of events frame by frame. His initial radio message after the crash had been laced with frustration, his tone sharp, almost defiant. He had been forced into a position where he had to make a split-second decision, to back out and concede the corner or to hold his line and make a statement. He had chosen the latter. But had that choice been reckless? Had he been too aggressive? Or had he simply done what any world-class driver would do in his position? Refused to be intimidated, refused to back down? Hamilton, meanwhile, was nowhere to be found. The 7-time world champion had delivered a brief, terse interview before disappearing from the paddock, his body language betraying the frustration he felt. His words had been carefully chosen, but the underlying message was clear: he was furious. Completely unnecessary, he had remarked when asked about the crash. There's a time and place for pushing the limits, and this wasn't it. For someone who had built his career on resilience and precision, losing an entire test day to an incident that, in his mind, should have never happened, was beyond frustrating. Back in the Mercedes hospitality suite, team principal Toto Wolff was engaged in deep conversations with the team's legal and technical staff, assessing their options. Wolff, known for his calculated approach to high-stakes situations, was faced with a decision. Should Mercedes take the diplomatic route, chalking this up to an unfortunate accident, or should they escalate the matter and demand an official FIA intervention? His team had just lost an entire afternoon of data collection, an unforgivable setback in a season expected to be one of the most competitive in recent history. As the Bahrain sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the paddock, the storylines were already taking shape. This was no ordinary pre-season testing incident. This was the beginning of something far greater. A rivalry that had been simmering was now on the verge of explosion. The dynamics between Leclerc and Hamilton, between Ferrari and Mercedes, had been irrevocably altered. Was this just an unfortunate clash, or had Leclerc deliberately sent a message? Was Hamilton's anger justified, or was this simply the nature of elite competition? Would the FIA intervene, or would they allow the tensions to simmer unchecked? The only certainty was that the 2025 Formula One season had just received an injection of drama before the lights had even gone out for the first race. The stage was set. The first battle had been fought. And what was coming next promised to be nothing short of legendary.